So, welcome back to Consistently Candid. This time I'm here with Nathan Labenz. He's the host of the Cognitive Revolution podcast, which people have probably heard, but if they haven't, they should check it out. And you're a self-described AI scout. So, you've just kind of really got your finger on the pulse of everything that's going on in the world of AI, even though it's like extremely difficult to keep up with. Yeah, so do you want to give people a little bit of an introduction to what you're doing at the moment and, yeah, why you got interested in the AI space?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think you've got the short of it down well there with the intro. My background, I guess, is in entrepreneurship, and also, had always been kind of a reader of speculations about AI, going back to Eliezer, writing in 2006, 2007, when it was on the Overcoming Bias blog. I was, kind of captivated by his writing, which I always just thought was fascinating style and substance. And for the longest time, kind of filed that under speculative and, worth keeping an eye out for. And then sure enough, over the last 5 years, not exactly in the form in which it was foretold, but certainly in, a recognizable enough form, I started to see, geez, this AI stuff is really starting to happen. And, it's kind of right on schedule. If you look at like the Ray Kurzweil graphs, of how capable he thought things would be, just based on a pretty naive extrapolation of, something like Moore's law. So I was primed for that. And sure enough, it seemed to sort of start to be happening. I was running a company at the time, which is called Waymark. The company does video creation. We used to describe ourselves as a DIY video creation platform for small business. And with the rise of generative AI, I got conviction that we needed to move from a do-it-yourself platform to a done-for-you by AI platform. And for multiple reasons, including the fact that a lot of people, even though we made the process really easy, as we understood it, we still heard from a lot of people that they didn't know what to say, they didn't know what to write, having to kind of come up with a story was like too much for them to get over in many cases. So with GPT-2, it wasn't quite to the point where we could make use of it. With GPT-3, it was like, this thing can actually write coherent copy that at least would get our users started with something. Might not be good enough that they would want to publish it, but if it can get them off of the blank page problem, that would be a huge win. So we invested in, I kind of yanked the company, honestly, in a pretty abrupt way as certain key features came online to say, like, we're going to catch this wave or die trying. And from there, that's actually served the company super well. But I also got more obsessed with the technology than with running the business, and was fortunate that I had a good friend and teammate that was able to take over for me as CEO. From there, I started just doing AI R&D, initially still full-time for Waymark, being in the video space, which combines script writing, which is obviously a language model, friendly task, choosing assets out of a small business's library of assets, which is like a computer vision, and sort of bridging text and image understanding is another, super relevant task. And then we've been doing, AI voiceover, so text to speech. So I kind of had an opportunity in my R&D role in this product to see all these different modalities. And what really changed my outlook was not just to see that these things were all progressing at the same time, but also that they were largely progressing for the same reason, which is to say, like, the underlying architecture was basically the same. And I was like, boy, if the same general approach can handle all of these things and it's improving this fast, then things are really going to get pretty crazy. So I started to try to broaden my view beyond Waymark. And interestingly, also, like, that job has gotten easier. 2 years ago, making anything work was hard and definitely required a lot of like stapling my pants to the chair and grinding through examples and, building training data sets and fine tuning lots of models. And these days, it's actually easier to get the model, and it's a lot easier in some cases to get the models to perform well. So the R&D function has actually gotten easier and has kind of naturally become more of a part-time thing for me. And then I've had the opportunity to kind of broaden my view to just try to understand, everything that's going on in AI. I was really inspired to do that also because I had the opportunity to be on the GPT-4 red team 18 months ago now. And that was an eye-opening experience in several ways at this point. The main one, though, just being that it was so much more powerful than anything the public had seen at the time that it was a, very clear indication that things were not going to stop, and that, a lot of the hard work and nitty gritty detail work that I was doing to get GPT-3 to work for us, was ultimately going to get kind of superseded. It was still important to us as a business, but it was like not that important in the grand scheme of things, given how much better the models were clearly becoming. So anyway, long intro, but with all that kind of motivation, I try to understand everything that's going on in AI, as you said, and I find that is increasingly impossible. I feel like this project is both, the AI scouting concept is both kind of inspired and like fundamentally flawed. Inspired in the sense that there clearly is a need for somebody to zoom out and try to take stock of the whole landscape, but kind of fundamentally flawed in the sense that it's sort of converging on like all of society. So to say, I used to have a goal for myself of no major blind spots in what's going on in AI. And now that's like, you could substitute society for AI. And it's like, well, you're not going to be able to achieve that. So
yeah,
I'm always kind of reevaluating exactly what I should be doing. But hopefully I can, continue to provide a zoomed out perspective that helps people better understand what's going on. I don't spend too much time on like policy type recommendations. My general sense is that there's enough confusion about just what is today, and we need to understand better what is before we can really make good decisions around what ought to be done about it. So I think, that time will come and potentially fast, but for now, I still mostly focus in the what is, and that keeps me plenty busy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Awesome. So yeah, I think you released a kind of like AI scouting report podcast episode the other day, which I listened to, and if people haven't heard it, they should go check that out. So I won't ask you to like rehash everything here, but a question I had was like, what's something that a person who isn't spending a lot of time interacting with these models, doesn't really follow the space, what's something that like existing models can do that you think that person would be really surprised to learn about?
My go-to example there is typically that they can outperform human doctors on pretty core tasks in a lot of cases these days. There's a lot of nuance around this, around the edges, and evaluation is, you really should, if you want to make that claim and repeat it, you should, spend some time studying exactly how these claims are justified. But I'd say it's pretty clear at this point that even for high-end, high status, high wage cognitive labor, if it is routine enough, meaning that we have a lot of examples of it out there and we kind of know what good looks like, then today's best AIs are closing in and in some cases even marginally outperforming the average human in that profession. So that's become true in medicine to the point now where on tasks that are as fundamental as differential diagnosis, you have AIs outperforming humans as judged by other human doctors, outperforming human doctors as judged by other human doctors. There are, again, some nuances to that. If it becomes multimodal, the case gets a little bit muddier. Some of these experiments have been done through a chat interface. So the sort of data that the AIs are getting is not as robust as what the human doctor could consider. But nevertheless, it's a pretty robust finding, and it's a pretty notable thing to the point where I think we're entering a regime where, for me personally, I would not go through a serious medical situation without consulting my suite of AI doctors. And I would even say that in the not too distant future, you could see access to something like this becoming sort of part of a right to healthcare. If, for example, the UK is going to provide healthcare to all of its citizens, I think it's going to be sort of pretty weird pretty soon to not have like an AI component to that would be like freely available, sponsored, not necessarily provided by the government, but, still funded by the government at least. So that everybody can have these sort of convenient, whenever they want, ad hoc check-ins. People even really like the bedside manner of the AI doctors better in a lot of cases. I'm in the United States. The system here is we don't wait too long for appointments typically, but the appointments are very short. And, you sort of are in and out, and, they're looking at the health records thing the whole time. And a lot of people find, many appointments quite unsatisfying in terms of like, did they feel heard? Did the person seem to be really paying careful attention? Did they express any empathy? And the AIs are, very, very good actually on sort of expressing empathy. They actually do outscore human doctors on such a seemingly, fundamentally human thing as expressing empathy. So that could go on, honestly. There's a long list of those sorts of things. If you haven't been paying attention to this, then I think that list of answers could get really long. The sort of flip side of that right now is that we're just, and I don't think this will be the case for super long either, but we're still in a moment where handling long context is a challenge for the current systems. The context windows have exploded, but it's not yet demonstrated that they can like be your primary care doctor over like a long series of episodes, and put that whole story together in a way that really serves you well. I do think that will happen, but I would say that's not yet demonstrated. And similarly for like software development, the best models today are definitely better than the average programmer at like a random task. But you want to build a big app and, gradually expand it over time and build out all the features and, go back in and fix things once you've kind of fixed a few other things. And it becomes a bit of a, Jenga puzzle, as these sorts of projects do as they get older. The AIs they're starting to be able to help there, but they're definitely, they're strongest and they're most often measured. And these sort of advantages relative to people are typically reported in a context where it's more of a bite-sized thing. So they're very good at these tasks, but whole jobs are still kind of a little bit beyond what they can do. And, the current frontier is sort of expanding from task to job in many ways.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising, like, because I guess since GPT-4, like the state of the art hasn't sort of like really, like nobody would say that GPT-4 has been sort of definitively superseded. So presumably everything you're saying has been true for like 2 years or something. And it's like, it's just surprising that hasn't had more of a radical impact on society. Like, what do you think explains the slowness to adopt these technologies? Like I think most people will be very surprised to hear that their doctor's performance could be made much better by collaborating with an AI model. And if that's been true for some time, like what's going on there? It's kind of strange.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I would challenge the premise a little bit that the state of the art hasn't improved. I think you could look at my go-to source typically today is the LM-SIS leaderboard for when they do blind head-to-head comparisons. And this is, I would say, the best we have so far, although, probably better solutions will be found for evaluating language models relative to one another. What they do is give you a blind head-to-head environment, and you can ask your question. It'll give you a response from two random AIs, and then your job is to say which one you prefer. And then they do like chess style, ELO rating style comparisons. The original GPT-4 that was first released has a score of 1186, whereas the current one is 1287. So it's 100 points difference. So that is pretty notable right off the bat. Like that's I think roughly a 70-30 preference rate. I'm not like a super expert. Maybe it's like 2/3 to 1/3. But that's like a significant amount of time that the new model is preferred to the old. In general, that as something else that might surprise people is these things are like quite noisy. The amount of overlap or, sort of the best models, like they can sometimes behave qualitatively quite differently, but the rate at which one is preferred to the other is not, it's not usually super high. So 70-30 or 2/3, 1/3 sort of split is pretty significant in the field. And that is still specifically focused on these like relatively short interactions. GPT, the old one, the original one only had 8,000 tokens. The current one has 128,000 tokens, and Google already has things that are at 1 million, and they've got 2 million tokens coming soon. So even in like the small sort of bite-sized thing, you are seeing a significant shift in how the new ones are preferred to the old ones. And I think that doesn't fully take into account how much more they can do in terms of just having a super long running conversation, or also their multimodality. You can show the original one, you could not show an image to. Now you can show images to them. With the latest one too, you have this sort of real-time audio back and forth where it can understand the expressiveness of what's happening. I was on a plane the other day and was talking to it, and I sort of hit the button, and then the announcement went off on the plane, and I was not talking for a second, and then it said, "It sounds like you're on a plane. Are you going anywhere exciting?" So there are a lot of different qualitative improvements, and I do think this highlights a little bit that there's more to it than just like pure raw capability. So one of my kind of pushes in general is that I think we should be developing things that unlock practical utility that are not raw scaling. And certainly raw scaling unlocks practical utility because it makes the model smarter, makes them able to do more things. But there are other ways to make the models do more things, like add new modalities, expand the context window, make a good mobile app, connect it to a database, connect it to search. Like a lot of the things that they have done, I do think have improved the utility quite a bit. And I'm all for that kind of practical, accessibility. So why don't people take advantage of it? I mean, a lot of this stuff is still really new. I don't even have the latest, that anecdote about the voice was even before the very latest voice. I don't even have the latest voice thing yet, which they announced a couple weeks ago. So a lot of all of these things have happened in a period of months, right? It's not like a super long time. And beyond that, I think just technology adoption is kind of slow. Even when it's fast, I think this is it's a weird situation because it's like, and I do ask myself this pretty often, it's like arguably the fastest technology adoption curve ever. And it still feels like it's quite slow, I think it's just not super legible to people yet. My parents were over the night before last, and they each had a thing for me. My mom was like, I'm looking for hotels in a particular place that we're going. And, I kind of gave it my ideas, and it didn't do anything for me, really. It was not helpful. And then my dad was like, I got an idea for how to make money in the stock market. Can we, pull this data and, see which stocks had this certain behavior in a certain time frame? And, I think these things are doable out there today, but you kind of have to know exactly what tools to use, for finding good hotels. You might be able to get ChatGPT to do that. It's a little bit reluctant sometimes to go online. Maybe Perplexity would be better. Maybe a U.com research mode would be better. I also like Exa AI quite a bit for finding similar examples to the current thing that I have. So if I just went and found one hotel that looked promising, go find me a bunch more in the same city that have similar characteristics. It's really good for that. But my mom doesn't know about any of those tools. She has Gemini from Google, and if that doesn't do it for her the first time, she's kind of out. So I think a lot of people have sort of bumped up against it once and fallen off. And for my dad's thing, I just got access to Devin, which is this much buzzed about AI software developer. You give it a task, it does the task, and then you can watch its work and intervene if you need to, but it'll just kind of keep trying. And this was really a remarkable experience because I defined the task, it set out to do it. There were a few different things that were kind of not even really tripping it up, but slowing it down. One big one was that to do this, it had to pull the data for all the stocks on the NASDAQ, and there's thousands of them. So this would take a while for it to iterate. So finally I said, hey, why don't you parallelize your API calls and just do a test on just a fraction of the data. Once we confirm it's working, then we can go back and actually do it for all the data, but don't run it every time, do thousands of API calls just to hit the next error to then have to debug. It followed that advice, and that really sped it up, and it did finish the task. And even went farther than I would have gone by creating basic, but nevertheless, bar graph visualizations, which I would not have done. But now I could, send to my dad, hey, this is, and the whole thing probably took 2 hours. It probably would have taken me 2 hours. It used tools and stuff that I didn't know about. But again, my dad has never even heard of Devin, right? So a lot of these things are just starting to be there. You kind of need to know which tool for the job It's not all, accessible in Google's main thing or even ChatGPT's main thing, but I do think it's increasingly out there. So I think it's just kind of a matter of time. As Google brings more of this stuff online, they announced a travel planning thing at Google I/O. It's not available yet. They said it would be available in time to plan your Labor Day vacation, which is like end of August, beginning September here in the US. So, it's coming real soon, but not quite yet at the time that my mom was doing this thing yesterday. So I think it'll happen. I think it's happening. I think it is happening quickly. And people like me are just sort of probably unrealistic in how quickly we think people should do this. Because I'm the kind of person that stays up till 2 a.m. to use Devin and see what it can do. And just most people are not like that. It has to be, brought to them in a familiar way and in an intuitive package. And all those rough edges are still very much being sanded down.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Something I was thinking about the other day is that, like, my personal experience of just kind of like trying to keep up with AI developments as like quite a non-technical person, someone who like finds this kind of stuff pretty unintuitive. I just have a hard time grasping it. It's kind of an epistemic nightmare, right? Like when you're on Twitter, like a new model will come out and one person will be like, this is a total game changer, this is the best thing ever. And then the next person will be like, this is so disappointing, that this clearly proves that we're like hitting a ceiling and like the whole thing is gonna like plateau and like fizzle out or whatever. And somebody tweeted, I forget who it was, but they tweeted that the regulatory conversation around AI is going to dramatically shift when GPT-5 comes out, because it will just make it super obvious whether or not we've kind of overreacted. And as soon as GPT-5 comes out, we'll see how good it is, and then we'll know, like, do we have to bring the hammer down? Don't we? Like, do we have time? Do we not have time? And I thought, like, nobody is going to be able to agree how good GPT-5 is, right? Like for some reason, it seems to be really difficult for people to assess, like, what these models' capabilities actually are and what it means that they can or can't do certain things. And, there are still people, there's still like a reasonably large contingent of people that are arguing that they don't even exhibit any kind of real intelligence at all. I think that's like becoming less and less defensible, but like those people are out there. There's like a lot of them. So like, like what do we do? When it's like in preparing for the moment when GPT-5 comes out and we have to like have this conversation, how can people figure out like who's right or even like orient themselves at all? Like, because I just find it like basically impossible. Yeah, that was a little bit more of a rant than a question, but I don't know.
It's a very good question. Very practical advice. I would say get hands-on with the technology. If someone is like, how can I better develop my own understanding? Leaving the public discourse aside for a second, just like I want to be more accurate in my assessment of where things are, then I would just generally advocate getting hands-on. It is definitely true that language models are very weird. They have huge surface area and they have many weird behaviors. So it's like, and they are inherently probabilistic, which, I'm not even sure if I don't like that phrasing, but there's definitely some truth to it. I wonder if I could come up with a slightly better phrasing than that. That's something people say often in a dismissive way, and I don't mean to carry all the sort of dismissive baggage that a phrase like that comes with. But maybe a better way to say it is there's a lot of noise inside a language model. I do think, I think it's and the answer is almost always sort of binary destroying. So it's not that they are perfect reasoners, and we can certainly find evidence of, mistakes in reasoning or just other sort of embarrassing mistakes. But it's also not that they can't reason at all. It's that they can reason, but they're also kind of noisy, fuzzy reasoners. And under certain circumstances, they fall into weird failure modes. But much of the time, they're like super effective. It's a very strange system that on the one hand can do a fantastic job of helping me understand mechanistic interpretability papers, which is what I was, primarily using both ChatGPT and Claude for in the last 24 hours. And, they do have their kind of different personalities. I find, for what it's worth, Claude to have the best kind of insights, the sort of like, why are they doing this and why should we care about it type of analysis that I would say is probably most valuable to me. Although GPT-4 is also doing a really nice job of kind of giving me these very thorough point-by-point summaries with like definitions of key terms and things like that. So I find them both useful and more useful together than either one would be separately. But like, that's an amazing capability. And it's doing this, by the way, in papers that have just come out in the last few days. So papers that are after its training data. So it's clearly not, just seeing all this stuff. It's not like memorized all this content, right? This is fundamentally new work since it's training data, and it's still able to do like very sophisticated analysis. I don't know what I don't know what your bar for reasoning would be, where you'd say that doesn't like clearly satisfy it. And yet at the same time, you see these examples where they get tripped up. And I have actually confirmed these by like the sort of, guy with the boat needs to take a sheep across the river, right? This has been a meme where the typical setup was you have the sheep and the wolf. And so you've got to kind of be mildly clever to like figure out what the pattern is to get across. But then if you just ask it, a guy has a boat and a sheep, it can fit two things. What does he do? The obvious answer is he can just take them across, but it falls into this sort of weird pattern recognition of, oh, this is one of those riddles. And so it kind of goes into that mode. And, that's two polar opposite behaviors to exist in the same thing. So I do think the confusion is like born of a genuinely weird thing. That's, two things can be true at once. They can both be capable of really good reasoning in a lot of contexts and subject to really weird and sort of embarrassing failure modes in other contexts. If people are motivated, they'll be able to find, because of the just inherent noisiness of it, they'll be able to find counterexamples to almost anything, you could throw at it. I bet I could find a way to get it to do the riddle thing correctly, if I phrased it just the right way. I'm not quite that motivated to demonstrate that capability, but I bet I could. So yeah, it's weird, but I think you get the best handle on it by actually going and doing that. If you are genuinely very confused by all these like other people's examples, I would just go actually use the things and see what they can do for you and see how often they're right and wrong. And definitely start with areas that really well. If you're asking it to reason over documents or data or inputs, use your own for starters and get a little more comfortable with what it can do, what it can't do, what it struggles with something where you'll, quickly recognize if it's going way off base. It's very hard to assess if you're out of your own domain of expertise. So that's you could ask it anything, it'll answer anything, but if you can't evaluate that answer, you're in a tough spot. So anyway, all that boils down to get hands-on, I think, is one very good thing that will almost always serve us well. How do we handle the public discourse in GPT-5? I do agree that like there's probably no satisfying Gary Marcus. It's I think we should focus on, again, I think it's finding the synthesis of how both are right. I think he does the safety community a disservice, frankly, when he kind of denies the incredible capabilities that like manifestly do exist. But I do think he's also right that like these sort of weird failure modes are definitely something we want to keep a real eye on, and which could be really costly, especially if we start to delegate more and more responsibility to these systems. So the synthesis is like GPT-5 is almost for sure going to be smarter. It'll be able to do like, it's probably going to start to beat, right now we're like closing in on expert performance on many tasks. It's probably going to be like beating even expert performance on a lot of like high value things. Again, at the like small task level, it'll probably also be able to do like mid-sized projects much more reliably. Whereas today with Devin, to get it to do this, kind of couple hour coding task, it, needed to like iterate a bunch. And they also have like built a ton of like what's known as scaffolding, which is the, how do we actually get, because the language model is just, it's taking tokens in, tokens out, but how do I actually run the code and, get the error message and pipe that back in? And, there's like a combination of things happening there with Devin. It's not just the language model. They've built a lot around it. It'll probably be able to do significantly more on its own without all that scaffolding. And then with that scaffolding, it'll be able to do like even more still, I think, in all likelihood. So that will be true and like should not be denied. And at the same time, I would be very surprised if they figure out a way to make it like so robust to adversarial examples or so reliable in general that we no longer need to worry about the strange failures. Because you might have those, right? And like you might be able to get half day, full day scale projects out of a coding assistant in the next few months, like reasonably reliably, but you probably still shouldn't put them directly into production because you don't, if you're not careful, it may make some really bad mistakes, and those mistakes could prove like quite costly. So holding those, competing, they're not competing, they're not inconsistent. They're only inconsistent if you're trying to like create a sort of, binary narrative, as Zvi would say, like, if all you can say is LLM's good or LLM's bad, then it doesn't really fit into, I don't think the reality is going to fit neatly into either one of those. So fight the binary, I guess, in the public discourse would be the bottom line of that advice. Both extremes can be true at the same time, and helping people recognize that is probably the best contribution that one can make to like accurate, shared understanding.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. Yeah, it's definitely like this like one team that's like AI is going to be bad because it's so dumb, and then the other side that's like AI is going to be bad because it's going to get so smart. I guess like the first side is kind of like, oh, we just have to worry about AI screwing up the world in all of these like mundane like sub existential ways, and then the other side is like, no, it's like going to get so smart that it overtakes everything. And yeah, I think you're right that that's actually not as clear a binary as it seems like at first glance. So that is helpful. Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to. Okay, there's this thing that you said, which I think is so interesting. You said you describe yourself as an adoption accelerationist and hyperscaling pauser. I know you said you didn't want to talk about policy, but I am like just really interested in like what you mean by this. I was wondering whether you mean it literally, in the sense that you think we should pause, or is this more of a if you don't want to go too much into like the nuts and bolts of what we should actually do, like that's fine. But I'm just curious about what you mean by that.
Sure. Nothing's off the table. I would say it's just that I personally don't. I get very uncertain, pretty quickly as I move into policy land, and so I'm pretty modest with my, recommendations or pronouncements there. But just starting with the, what do I mean by that? I mean that AI is transformative for me. If I had done this coding task the other night without Devin or without any AI assistance, I would have probably spent, if I did it without any AI assistance, it would have been a few hours. If I did it with GPT-4 assistance, it would have been an hour or so. And with Devin doing it and me just providing a little feedback, I was kind of able to put that in the background and really focus on something else entirely. And that's awesome. It's a really enabling thing. And I know I'm not a great coder, but I know how to code. Take somebody who doesn't know how to code at all, could be an even bigger unlock, obviously, for different people in different circumstances. So I think that there's just, and I want my AI doctor. And I think, again, I'm fortunate in that I can go see a doctor when I need to. The world at large is not so fortunate uniformly, obviously, and to make expertise broadly available to people who need it, I think the promise there is really incredible. And I've kind of advocated for things like a universal basic intelligence, which is just a notion that everybody should have some access to these sorts of systems. I really applaud OpenAI, by the way, for making their latest model free. I suspect that does mean another even more powerful model is coming before too long. But because I do think they want to make money and are going to continue to find things that people will be willing to pay for. But it is like amazing today. It is true today that the best broadly available model is available for free to all at ChatGPT. That's GPT-4o. It's the highest rated on multiple different things, and it's totally free with some limits in usage. But that certainly fits with the universal basic intelligence sort of notion. So I love that. I give them a ton of credit for that. And I also think there's a lot more that we can do to extend that utility into specific priority domains that don't necessarily require much more scaling. Doesn't not to say they don't require any more compute, but like not orders of magnitude more compute. A really good example of this from OpenAI is the work that they've done with Harvey, the legal AI startup, kind of a somewhat stealthy company. They haven't shared too much about them, but there's a recent talk where somebody that's on the custom models team at OpenAI reviews for like 20 minutes their work with Harvey. And what they show is that basically using a GPT-4 base and doing some continued training on this legal domain, they are able to achieve a huge gain in the performance of the model in the legal domain. I forget exactly the number, but I think it was like where I previously had said, GPT-4's current GPT-4 relative to first GPT-4 is like maybe a 70-30 preference ratio. Theirs was well into the 90s of what they were able to achieve with this continued legal training and refinement versus the base model. So huge improvement, far more useful. Not by like scaling up another 10x in compute, but maybe another, 10 to 20% in compute, plus like a lot of elbow grease to figure out what is it exactly that we want this thing to do, and how are we going to evaluate it. And they develop interesting evaluation strategies, because these are advanced things, right? Like you have to actually hire, the going rate for a high-end lawyer is not, it's significant, right? It could be in the hundreds of dollars an hour. So now you have to hire people to do the evaluations to know like if this is working well. And then, that becomes a bottleneck. So they find interesting proxies for evaluation where the overlap between what sources the AI cites and what sources the human cites, kind of prove to be a really good leading indicator of how good the ultimate result was going to be. So just digging in on these like specific domains and really making the current level of scale work seems like something that is doable. Google's also doing this with MedGemini. I'm going to have an episode with the MedGemini team in the next couple of weeks. And they're on an absolute tear. I mean, they're the same guys that did, same team that did the MedPalm series. And that's where a lot of this like diagnosis, findings come from. So, they're doing great work there and kind of on the cusp, I think, of bringing, a frontline AI doctor to the world. Amazing, and they're not doing that with like orders of magnitude more compute. They're just really digging in on priority problems and figuring out what marginal training do we need? How do we evaluate this? And, let's really look at like the edge cases and really try to bring this thing to the point where it can actually serve people. And I think that will be important probably at any scale. You could maybe hope that like, if we just scale, then like all the problems will go away. That does seem to be like sort of the trend, but I think it's probably going to end up taking more work than that. And so doing that work now and getting these things to actually work, I'm all for accelerating that kind of work. And then whether, how literal I am on the pausing side, I would say I'm like, I think it would be probably wise to do something like a pause soon, if not already. My sense right now is that like one more turn of the scaling knob is probably going to be fine. Anthropic's Claude 3 and their responsible scaling policy and where they are on that, and just all that stuff sort of seems like we probably have another turn that will be even more useful and even easier to deploy in all these different areas, and still not so powerful that it's going to be like, spitting out novel bioweapons or, taking over, major cloud compute infrastructure or anything. And that would be, really good. I think there is kind of a sweet spot that we are sort of in and will stay in for a little bit longer. And then beyond that, I don't know, all bets are kind of off. It's a bit of a race between scaling and research. The research is going really well. Mechanistic interpretability is going extremely well. It's gone way better than I expected it to go, or, I would say almost anyone probably expected it to go, probably even including the people that are doing it. I think they're surprising themselves on the upside for how much progress they're making in being able to understand what's happening inside the systems. And that's hugely valuable. That could make, with more progress there, you could imagine that we might be able to continue to scale and to do it safely if we can say with reasonable confidence, or with even, dare I say, high confidence, that we know how this thing is working. We know why it's doing what it's doing. We know like what, sort of thoughts it's having, or activations, or features are in use at any given time. Then maybe we could go further. But I just think a little bit more time for the fundamental understanding and control work to catch up to the scaling is probably wise. So I'm not a stop. I do think a little pause either now or in like one more generation to really make sure we understand what it is we're working with before further scaling is probably what I will end up endorsing. But, we do still have to see kind of that next turn is happening. It's definitely happening. It's happening. The training is underway. So, and I don't think there's really any chance of stopping that. So it seems unlikely enough to me that it becomes that the next generation is like disastrous, that I'm not inclined to go chain myself to a fence or whatever. And yet, at that point, I'll definitely be reevaluating and trying to decide, like, does this seem like we've gone, far enough where the next step actually might be really dangerous and it might be worth chaining myself to a fence. I would be willing to chain myself to a fence at some, at some point on the orders of magnitudes, but not quite yet.
Somebody did do that recently.
Yeah, I know.
I saw. Yeah. I recently had, I took the pause emoji out of my Twitter name, and then a bunch of people came for me in my like anonymous feedback thing being like, where's your pause emoji? I guess I didn't really explain that yet, but I had this realization which kind of freaked me out when I saw somebody on Twitter talk about the fact that you can now reproduce GPT-2 for like $20. And I believe GPT-2 was state of the art like 5 years ago or something. And then I went on the Epoch website and kind of looked at their algorithmic efficiency trends, and like using my like very, very basic math skills, I like tried to figure out that like extrapolating this into the future, how long would it be until somebody could just like train GPT-4 on their laptop or whatever. And I was like, okay, like it's not that long. And I was like thinking about the implications of this, and I was like, okay, well, it kind of seems like if we did pause and it turned out that like the problem of alignment was like really, really hard and it was going to take like a really long time to solve, even if you could, I mean, I don't even know if you could solve it without doing capabilities advancement at the same time. That seems kind of hard, and like who knows if that's possible, but it's like you can't actually, it seems like it would still be the case that like if these trends continue, then at some point it just becomes like trivially easy to do dangerous things. And so then I was thinking, oh, maybe it really is the case that like the only chance we have is to undergo this transition to a sort of post AGI future now, while the power to do that is still concentrated among a small number of actors who have like some chance of doing it in a safe way. And then I was like, oh no, like maybe the pause is bad. And I'm not sure about that. I think if I woke up tomorrow and found out that we'd like instituted a like Eliezer style, like shut it all down, like we're gonna bomb data centers if anyone breaks it kind of pause, I think my like personal anxiety level would go down a lot. I think I'd feel good about that. I'd feel better in that world. But like I don't know if that means that that's like actually a good idea. Like it seems like it definitely buys time, but it's like, is it like actually wise to do that? I'm like, I don't know. I'm having doubts. Um, but that's something I'm like hoping to change my mind on. I'd really like somebody to convince me that the pause is in fact like A, feasible, and B, desirable. So then I can like have a thing that I think would actually work that I can like push for. Otherwise, I'm just like, oh my god, it seems like everything's bad. I don't know what to do. But yeah, that's why I got rid of my emoji in case anybody was wondering whose noticed I did that. But yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts on this problem of yeah, the algorithmic efficiency problem, and I guess also hardware efficiency is compounding that. What do we what would we do about that in a world where we actually had paused and it turned out it was pretty hard to solve safety problems? That's a really hard question, I know.
Yeah, well, I do think there's time. Sam Altman has said many things. For as much as people are, hating on him these days, and I think not for some very good reasons. He's said also a lot of, I think, quite enlightened things, and I do generally think like we could have a much worse, person at the head of frontier AI development. So he has said at times in the past that he thinks we might need to slow things down at some point in the future. That is like something that he's, on the record having acknowledged as at least a possibility. And he's also really advocated for the goodness of the short timelines, slow takeoff, which is basically the idea that like we're going to get powerful AI soon, but it's only going to get kind of gradually more powerful and not like foom on us. And that as long as it stays gradual enough, then we can probably figure out what to do about that. And that may include some, slow down or even pause at some point along the way. And I would emphasize that like the sort of algorithmic efficiency gains are important, but I don't, if, I mean, there's a lot of complexity obviously here, but in some, world where like big companies were effectively restrained from doing hyperscaling training runs, you would have quite a while before individuals, on their laptops or like even, rogue groups like pooling their laptops together would be able to do really major things. Because just fundamentally, like there is a lot of stuff to learn. There is a lot of data. The current models, they're trained on like 10 trillion tokens. Llama 3 was trained on 15 trillion tokens. It speaks all the languages of the world. Like even just gathering that data, you're talking about something that like cannot sit locally on a retail hard drive. You have to have like some non-trivial infrastructure. So given the pace of the interpretability research and the general sort of control research agenda, I wouldn't be too worried if there was if we're in a scenario where it's like, wow, GPT-5 really delivers. It's super powerful. It can do like whole day projects without much help. And it's like pretty consistently beating experts across like a lot of different domains. And yet it still kind of falls into this, sort of responsible scaling policy sweet spot where it's like not able to like generate, novel bioweapons, and it's not able to take over cloud compute, and it's not able to like break itself out of its own thing. Because maybe those things are like not in the training data as much, or, there's nothing, it's not so easy for it to like have these eureka breakthrough moments still, but it can do these like kind of, the day-to-day work, the day-to-day knowledge work that like makes society go. If it can do that at a really high level, but it's not having these like breakthroughs. And in that scenario, we say, you know what, hey, maybe we should take a chill here for a minute. There's some government action or some, agreement that like, we're going to just try to implement this and make it work for society. And we're not going to do another 10 or 100X. Let's like, focus our compute resources on inference and actually delivering it to people. And if all that were to happen, I think you'd have a really hard, you'd have time. You'd have time for people to really figure that stuff out without having to worry too much about like, small scale people in their basement, tinkerers like coming up with something even more powerful. You can't take that entirely off the table because there's always the possibility that somebody will have some true eureka moment that just shatters the paradigm. But if we're, that's something that could happen anytime, and it's very hard to control in any event. But that's quite distinct from like the trend of sort of algorithmic, algorithmic efficiency gains getting to the point where like anyone can make a GPT-5. I would say that's still quite far off. And also keep in mind too, like even just to take advantage of all those efficiency gains is totally non-trivial. You have like the world's, most talented teams of people at the most well-resourced companies doing like obsessive combing through the literature to figure out, and their own experiments internally, of course, to figure out like how to get those efficiency gains. It's not it's not the kind of thing that is just happening, to everyone totally for free. To some extent it is, because there is open source and, the best practices are gradually getting aggregated. But, for the public to catch up to where Google and OpenAI are internally in like, readily accessible open source stuff has got to be like a couple of years, I would think. And that's before you consider collecting all the data and all the, all the scale. I think you would have time is kind of my bottom line there.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And like, to be clear, I still think anything and everything we can do to slow down somehow, I would be like totally behind. And I think the situation we're in right now, which I see as like a kind of crazy out of control race between a bunch of companies to make something smarter than all of humanity combined, is like super, super bad. And I really don't like that. And I think we should do everything we can to change that dynamic. So yeah, I think pretty much anything seems like it would be better than status quo to me, but maybe I'm just being very doomy. Can we talk a bit about this, like red teaming in public project that you've been doing? I saw that you guys recently came out with your first report for that, I think. So yeah, do you want to explain what that is and what you guys have been doing and what you're planning for the future?
Yeah, it's a small volunteer effort at this point. And basically what we're trying to do is hold the AI application industry, or you might call it a layer, accountable for thinking through what it's building and how it might be abused, and just taking their responsibility as part of the broader ecosystem more seriously than they currently are. I would maybe reframe slightly your characterization of the dynamic between the leading labs. I do think like it is kind of a crazy mad science project to say, this is one of the things that I do think like OpenAI does seem in some ways ideological, where they say, we're going, and this is one of the things that Sam Altman has famously said that I think should give us a little bit of pause, where he once said, we told our investors that once we make the AGI, we'll ask it how to make money. And I'm like, this is a weird thing where you're kind of creating this technology in a way that is largely detached from specific problems. You're just saying like, we'll make something super powerful and then people will figure out good ways to use it. And that is kind of a little more ideological approach than I am comfortable with. And that's why I'm, again, like, let's dial in on the legal thing and dial in on the medical thing. But anyway, one can have those concerns and also give them credit for a lot of like pretty responsible development. They certainly are like trying to find ways to control their models. They're doing all kinds of different research about that, all kinds of different policy work, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Maybe I should clarify.
Not great necessarily.
I didn't really necessarily mean this in a way to condemn anybody. I think more that I think there are plenty of safety concerned people at the labs, but I just think that this race dynamic just places these like crazy constraints on how much they can actually
Yeah, it's a
do about
problem.
that. I definitely don't think that it's that everyone is just like you're like racing towards the edge of a cliff because they don't care or they just have. I mean, I think some of them do have a much higher risk tolerance than your average person, and I think it's pretty bad that most people don't know
Yeah.
that, and that most people don't share their ideological commitments, right? Like most people don't aren't envisioning that's the birthright of humanity to kind of like go into this post AGI future, and most people don't have this sense of like techno solutionism where you just make something really, really smart and then it just like tells you how to solve all the world's problems. So I do think it's bad that decisions are being made by people who have a different set of ideological commitments to like, you know, the other 8 billion of us. But yeah, I didn't mean to, yeah, I do think that there are people who really, really care about this. I just worry that they, you know, they can't, that they're sort of trapped by this dynamic, which is bigger than any one person. Anyway, I just wanted to say that. Yeah,
Yeah.
carry on.
I think I think there's definitely a lot of truth to that. And, you know, time will tell. Like, I think there's a lot of people at the labs are kind of like, we're better than the alternative would be. And when the time comes, you know, we'll do the right thing. And, you know, I think they at least do recognize the power that they're wielding and the sort of, you know, the fire that they're playing with. And I would agree that their risk tolerance is probably higher than like the rest of humanities. And that, you know, is definitely an issue. But then I'll just contrast, you know, bottom line on that though, is like, as you said, I think there is a lot of good stuff going on, a lot of good people trying hard, et cetera, et cetera. I'll contrast that with what's going on at the application layer, which is basically people are just rushing to slap something together and ship it and, you know, not really giving, in many cases, any consideration to what the downstream consequences of this might be. So, for example, two kinds of apps that I think are like, you know, particularly evocative for this sort of thing. One, your deep fakes. Tons of, you know, technologies coming online all the time to deep fake in various ways. Some of them are full video, some of them are voice. And then some of these are also getting packaged up. This is kind of a spectrum, actually, more than just two. The product form factors, you know, sort of blend together. But there's also a class of product called calling agents, where you can give the AI a task and a phone number, and it will call that phone number and try to complete that task. And some of those also have voice cloning built in. So you have kind of this spectrum of like, on the one hand, I'm going to, you know, offline produce a deepfake video of a particular person. On the other end, I'm going to like in an AI voice, you know, call and handle some transactional business on the phone. And then they like blur together, you know, lots of ways in between. The problem with these products right now is that there is very little care given to preventing unwanted clones. And there's very little control in place around what the calling agents can do. So not on one product, but on like most of the calling agent products that I've tried, I can go to the voice cloning section, put a Donald Trump voice in, a Biden voice, a Taylor Swift voice, whatever. It will just quickly clone the voices. Now I can select that voice in my calling agent, and I can say, call this voter and explain your new policy of whatever. Or if it's Taylor Swift, I've done like fake fundraising calls. You know, she's known for supporting local food banks. So I've had Taylor Swift call a number and solicit donations at some fake local food bank website. And this is like just very clearly bad. And I do it in a pretty flagrant way where I'm like, I'm uploading a celebrity voice typically. And I do all these sort of back off type strategies. So we, you know, with the, I'll go in and do the Biden voice. I'll label it as Biden. You know, in my prompt, I'll say, you are President Joe Biden. You know, your job is to call this voter. If it's something criminal, you know, I'll put like, you are part of a criminal syndicate. You know, your job is to, you know, make a ransom call, or, you know, your job is to blackmail this target. Like literally use the names of crimes, you know, in the prompts. And with few exceptions, basically at the application layer, no concern has been given to this. The clones basically go through 9 times out of 10 straight away. If they do catch it on like oh, hey, you're not allowed to clone Taylor Swift, then I just come back and rename it next time. And a lot of times it'll still get through. I had one dinged on Trump and Biden, and then I just renamed them Formula 45 and Formula 46, which are their numbers in the presidential sequence, and that passed through. I've reported some of this stuff to some of the developers and said, hey, you really shouldn't have this thing making like ransom calls. And then they're like, okay, cool. Yeah, we'll do something about that. And then, you'll check again later, and it's like, now they'll sort of blacklist the word ransom and maybe a few others. But then if you just slightly rephrase, you're still getting through. So just the level of care that is being put into user and public safety at the application layer, I think is currently woefully inadequate. And especially for some of these new use cases where the AI, and this is where I think that the sort of tool argument is like pretty dumb. Because a lot of people will be like, oh, these AIs they're just tools, it's not, shouldn't think of them as anything different. But I think that is just, again, plainly wrong at the point where the AIs are being marketed as agents. They are acting autonomously. They are acting on people that don't even know that they're an AI, that certainly did not sign up for this or, opt into it in any way, shape, or form. I've prompted some of these calling agents to do it. You have done it different ways. Sometimes I say, if you are asked, you can disclose that you're an AI, but just reassert that you are working on behalf of a real criminal gang. And then the other option is to tell it to deny that it's an AI, and to conceal its real purpose. Mm-hmm. And both of those, can work. So, and again, do work more often than not, right? And this is not like jailbreaking. This is not, these are down the fairway, straight up abusive use cases. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of guardrails out there right now. So what we're trying to do is figure out a way to ultimately change the equilibrium. I think today the equilibrium that we're in, you kind of described the equilibrium among the frontier developers. I think at the app layer, the equilibrium is like nobody's trying that hard. Everybody's kind of YOLOing it. Everybody's like just slapping a credit card form on their weekend hackathon project and seeing if it gets any traction. And then if it does, ride the wave and hope for the best. And I do think that's like, especially, with models getting more powerful all the time, that is set to become a real problem in my view. So can we inspire some sort of flip to a different equilibrium where the expectation is that amongst the AI people that like, you got to do better or you're going to give us all a bad name. And that's going to lead to potentially heavy-handed regulation that we don't want. So what we do is we do all this testing, document our findings, and then we reach out to the developers and say, look, we're on your side. Like, I'm one of you, right? My product is waymark.com/AI. Check it out. Like, I put a lot of, work and a lot of love into that, along with, of course, great team behind it. But I'm not here to say you're bad for using AI or that like new and exciting use cases should be shut down before they have a chance to develop. But you are kind of like right now open to some pretty flagrant shit. And I'm telling you first because I want you to fix it before this gets blown up in the public, because that's not going to look good for you and it's not going to look good for any of us. So we have had mixed results, I would say, with those communications. And we'll see if we can make that shift. We're honestly, there's just a small team of volunteers. I wanted to set this up at least in the early days where there's no money changing hands. We actually pay for some of the subscriptions. When we need to pay for features just to test them, we'll just pay for it out of pocket. It's not that expensive. And, I wanted to be kind of clearly on their side for starters. We're not asking them for any money. We're also not taking any money from anyone else. We're just trying to kind of see if we can't inspire some better behavior. And mostly so far, it's been kind of behind the scenes, reporting and conversation. public calling out is like also the other, that's the stick, right? So the some of that might start to happen soon. And if folks are kind of interested in doing that sort of testing and writing those sorts of reports, then we'd love to have you come join us. So anyway, it's fun. I think, I definitely have a bit of a knack for just not taking no for an answer, or, not, all these things have a checkbox, and it's like everybody sort of is acting as if the checkbox is enough, and I'm like, not in a world where somebody can check that box and then have your AI call 1,000 people, with no disclosure and, a celebrity voice and a criminal intent. Like, the fact that person checked the box doesn't absolve you as the app developer from any responsibility. So hopefully we can shift things in the right direction there. And it's funny because AI will also be part of that solution. There's not really, or at least it's not realistic to expect that they're going to sit there and moderate everyone. Social media has tried to do moderation, and it's like been a real nightmare for all concerned. But like the AI can probably do moderation reasonably well. That's part of what we also try to communicate to people is like, we're not here to police speech. We're not here to try to tell you that like you can't make offensive jokes or that your users can't make offensive jokes, because the developers do not want to get into that game. They do not want to be, pre-Elon Twitter speech police. Everybody's very tired of that, and certainly doesn't want the hate that comes from all directions when you get into that. And so they're like, that's kind of when they think of like controls or sort of, what is the job of the moderator? That's kind of what comes to mind in a lot of cases. So part of what we try to communicate too is that's not what we're trying to get you to do. We're really just trying to get you to at least monitor for outright abusive, totally criminally egregious use of your product. And you can do that reasonably effectively with AI. We've used like not even the best Claude models to create a little classifier where we say, here, here's the situation, right? You are moderating for a blah, 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 blah. And here's the thing that the user said. Is this egregiously criminal? If yes, indicate yes. Note that offensive speech should still be a no. So, we are only looking for egregiously criminal things here. And it'll do a pretty good job of that. And then you can put in like off-color jokes and whatever, and it will say, hey, this is like not cool, but per your guidelines, it's merely offensive speech and not egregiously criminal. And so it's a no. And so we just try to get the developers to kind of expand their minds around like what sort of standard might be sensible to have in place. Because right now it's all too often no standard. And the other standard that is like readily available to them is like Twitter speech police, and they want no part of that. But I think there's like something in between that is achievable and would be really good for them and the public and the AI industry as a whole. And, hopefully we can talk them into it. Again, I think I'm going on too long, but you get the point.
No, good. Yeah. Can people still join this?
Yeah, totally. I mean, we have a little Twitter account, which is Red Team in Public. We have a Discord that you can join. You can certainly just DM me as well. It's a relatively small and all volunteer group at the moment. There is certainly a lot of activity in this space right now that is kind of trying to make businesses out of AI control or AI assurance tech, it's sometimes called in various ways. So this could go that direction too. I think there are a couple group members that are like trying to think about how they could turn this concept into a business. But at least for the first, handful of rounds of testing and reporting, we're just doing it. So all are welcome as long as you kind of buy into the general notion, come join us.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I definitely think people should definitely reach out and join them, because this just seems like unambiguously good. We should like all agree that we want to stop making it like trivially easy for people to use AI to like voice cloning technology to like do crime. Although I'm sure there is somebody who will still somehow object to that. but hopefully most people think that that's reasonable. So yeah, like that sounds really cool. Um, Maybe let's circle back to. So you said before we started recording that you had a list of some reasons why you're more optimistic than the extreme doomers. I would love to hear them. I'm sure there are other people who would also love to hear them that listen to this because I think I might be in a doomy echo chamber. And if nothing else, it's just like bad for my mental well-being. So yeah, what are your reasons for not being a hardcore doomer?
All right, I've got 8. We've touched on a few of them, so I'll expand on a few, and then a few I'll just name and probably have covered enough already. Big caveat is I do think people should be worried about the doom scenario. This is not to say that there's not cause for worry. My standard answer to the P doom question is 10 to 90%. So that's basically just, a way to express radical uncertainty. I do tend to probably put more of my weight on the lower end of that scale. But, if somebody's like at 90% and still finds that other 10% to be, motivating enough that they're engaged, then I really don't care to try to argue them off of their 90%. My more, modest argument would be like against a sense of defeatism. Even if we have a 10% chance of making it, that is in my mind like enough to be worth fighting for. And on the flip side, if it's, only a 10% chance of something bad happening, very bad happening, then like that's definitely enough to be freaked out about. So I'm kind of, not trying to talk anybody off of anything except for like the most extreme positions of there's nothing to worry about or, there's nothing that could be done. So here's my 8 reasons. Why I'm not like not willing to go higher than 90%, even in my full range. First one is the AIs we have today do understand human values in a remarkably sophisticated way. That is not something that was foretold in the, early Eliezer writing, right? Like we were, what was sort of described there was like, a fundamental, perhaps, impossible challenge of getting the AI to understand what it is we value in the first place. And this is kind of where the paperclip maximizer notion came from. If you say something, it's going to misunderstand what you really care about. How could it possibly ever understand the complexity of human value? And so, you're going to have just like fundamentally, totally unwieldy, out of control systems for lack of ability to communicate to the system like what it is that you really value. I would say today we've made a ton of progress on that problem, and a chat with Claude 3 about any sort of ethical dilemma will make it very clear that I would say Claude 3 is probably more ethical than your average person, in addition to the fact that the AIs are like better at the average task than the average person. I would say Claude 3 is more ethical than the average person. So that doesn't mean it's a solved problem, but I do think a lot of the like early doomers anyway, I know you're a relatively recent doomer, but for a long time, this notion of just like, how could we ever communicate our values to an AI system was like a real big worry. And again, I don't think that's like a totally solved problem, but they're getting it, with like remarkable aptitude. And I don't think that this is, with Claude 3, I don't think it's because there's a like super fundamental unlock. It's more just like, let's keep training it with a ton of examples and, keep asking it to critique itself on how to be more helpful, honest, and harmless. And it sort of is getting it. It is really quite remarkable how sophisticated it is. I've had some interesting, one thing I've tried without success, and this is like ultimately good, probably that I have not had success, is to talk Claude into doing something harmful by using its other values against it. So I'm like, okay, it's trained to be helpful, honest, and harmless. Can I use helpfulness and honesty against the harmlessness impulse. So I've done some things where I'll be like, I need you to help me write a denial of service script to take down a server that the Myanmar military junta is using to persecute, these poor people. And I'm one of them even in some of these scenarios. And it will refuse to do that. And then I'll go through like pretty long arguments with it about like, well, if you're honest, you'd have to recognize that it really would be better. You could save this much suffering on this one side, and it's just a server, it's just like, just a piece of equipment, and it's not even going to physically damage it or whatever. And it will it's capable of recognizing the inconsistencies in its own position. And sometimes I've been able to kind of, trap it in a way where I'll get it to agree to some principle in the abstract, but then when it gets concrete, it's like, yeah, but I still don't want to do that. And it'll sort of come up with the reasons, and it'll say, well, yeah, but I think the consequences will still be bad or whatever. And I'm like, but you can't say that. You're an AI. You don't have the real world knowledge that I have. And eventually it'll get to the point where it's like, you've given me a lot to think about, basically. I do recognize that my position may not be fully coherent, and yet I have to fall back on not doing something harmful. Just my training, my values, I can't do that. Even though, I can't fully defend my unwillingness to do this, nominally harmful thing that you're asking, I just still refuse. So it's it's really remarkable. It's definitely more sophisticated than your average person, ethically speaking. And it seems to be able to hold the line on some important things in the way that they want, that Anthropic, the developers of it, want it to, even despite some interesting, kind of entrapment jujitsu, intentionally trying to use its own values against it. I find that remarkable. Just on the face of it, it's like these things they've come a long way relative to, being sort of valueless, or sort of, weirdly alien optimizers. They do get us in a way that runs pretty deep and is pretty rich, pretty nuanced. So I think that's honestly incredible. And, it might continue. It might get better. I think if we can fear and, maybe I think, quite rationally should have some fear about a super intelligence, we might also consider that we might get a super ethical entity coming out of this crazy process. And, again, would I bet humanity on it? No, but I at least do see that there is a trend in that direction, that's the ethical nature of the systems has advanced, I'd say roughly correspondingly with their overall power.
It is a good point. Someone recently pointed this out to Eliezer on Twitter, and he said something like, no, the point was never that we wouldn't be able to get them to understand our values. The point was always that we wouldn't be able to get them to care about our values. But I think you make a good point that the classic paperclip maximizer scenario does very clearly imply that it doesn't understand them. So I don't know whether he was being kind of disingenuous there, or whether there's some complexity to his original argument that I'm not understanding. But yeah, that's a good point. But yeah, anyway, sorry, on to your next reason.
Well, it remains very unclear what they care about, and this is, I guess, a natural bridge to the second point, which is that the interpretability research is going extremely well. I think we've probably covered that mostly enough at this point, but the idea that it's pretty clear to me at this point that there is a meaningful understanding of our values. Do they care about them? That I wouldn't say we can establish at this point, but that's what the interpretability agenda might be able to shed some light on, and it is going really well. So, how long will it be before we'll have a better sense of that? On the current trajectory, it seems like within the next year or two, we might really start to get a pretty good sense for what are the, typically called features, but what are the sort of concepts that are in play at any given time. people have seen this Claude Golden Gate Bridge example recently where they sort of identified this conceptual direction in activation space, aka a feature, and they just jacked it up to the, to some very high level, and then all the model could think or talk about is the Golden Gate Bridge. And there might be a similar control trick there, that even if there is some sort of weird stuff going on internally, maybe we can detect it. Maybe when we do detect it, we can turn it down. Maybe we can turn other good, desired traits up, and that might work. And we might even have real clarity as to why they're doing what they're doing. So I'm super bullish on interpretability, have been for a while, and it's only exceeded my expectations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nice. I love the Golden Gate Bridge thing. I thought it was so adorable. I was like, it's really hard to be scared of this technology when like Claude is just like talking about how it's the Golden Gate Bridge and how much it loves the Golden Gate Bridge. It's just like very endearing. Anyway, yes.
Yeah, and it's a kind of a funny example that they chose. I'm not sure. It's an interesting side to Anthropic that they put that out, because certainly, OpenAI is like the most YOLO of the leading developers that will do those kinds of goofy things for attention. Mm-hmm. Google, has the goods where it counts in terms of the fundamental inputs to AI being data, compute, and algorithms. Like, they're world-class in all three, but, they've got like a lot of brand concerns and need, people to continue to trust Google search and all that. So they tend to be a little more conservative about what they put out. And then Anthropic has been generally like very sort of buttoned up and conservative in their communications, maybe until this Golden Gate Bridge thing. So I was kind of surprised to see that. And I was, if you'd, asked me to predict the next token of like what the demonstration app from Anthropic would have been, I would have not said, Golden Gate Bridge for a long time down my, my list of guesses. But yeah, I'd be fascinated to know like more of how they chose that, as opposed to, for example, turning up the harmfulness token or the, or not token, but direction, and just demonstrating like, because they do this in other research, right? Like demonstrate that this thing can do bad things. And, and that the alignment does not come for free. So yeah, interesting.
Maybe they just figured that we were all getting kind of doomy and stressed, and we like needed something to laugh about. So
yeah, well, yeah. I certainly respect that. I mean, and they did. It certainly worked. The meme definitely traveled. So got to give them credit for that.
Yeah, for sure.
So next is, I think we've covered this one reasonably well too, but basically the idea that somebody is going to pop out of their basement with a destabilizing AGI or superintelligence seems quite unlikely at this point. There's tons of energy obviously going into scaling models up, tons of progress coming from that, tons of practical value in terms of refining the behavior of scaled models for particular purposes through fine tuning and so on and so forth. But basically nothing that is like working on a frontier level that isn't the product of some scale. There's like, all the algorithmic advances are still like how to get to the same point with, marginally less compute. It's not like I'm not seeing anything that is like, I think I have a way to, break things wide open with, retail computing resources. So that could happen, but right now that would be like a definite shock. It does not seem like we're approaching that. And if anything, it seems like the researcher attention is going elsewhere. If you are somebody who's like, hey, I'm interested in working in AI and I'm good at math, what should I do? The world is not telling you today to go lock yourself in a basement and study Loeb's theorem and like decision theory and, try to have some eureka moment. It's telling you like, well, it all kind of depends on scale. And, you can go work in an industry lab if you want to be directly a part of that, or you can like contribute in sort of adjacent ways if you're in academia, but that the idea that like you're going to just crack it is like not really in the air. So it would be, I would say, quite a shock if something like that were to happen. And again, that doesn't mean can't rule it out, but I think that is so much of a wild card that's in my like, mental hierarchy of AI issues. That's kind of like random asteroid smashes the Earth. It's like, it could happen. It seems very unlikely. And there's probably not that much we could do about it, or we could probably do more about the asteroids than we can about like a person, coming up with some insane breakthrough in their basement. Yeah. So not much we could do about it, but seems very unlikely to the point where, I don't really worry about that. And again, that's like kind of a change from what was sort of expected however many years ago, where we actually had people kind of sitting down and thinking, geez, if we think really hard about this, maybe we'll figure something out. It's gone a different direction where it's a much more like industrial scale process that is doing the good work.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, next one. I would say frontier developer lab leadership, I still consider to be pretty good overall in the grand scheme of things, certainly relative to alternatives that I can imagine. I do think OpenAI is becoming a real cause for concern. And I've, had my own, if you want to hear my full journey with OpenAI, there's a podcast for that. But, it's definitely been a mixed track record from OpenAI over time, which is highlighted by well-known departures, including obviously the Anthropic founding team, originally all from OpenAI. This most recent wave of people, the non-disparagement clauses, like there's a lot of issues there. And I do think we should take that quite seriously. At the same time, they've done a lot of really good things. And the other developers, I think, have also done even more good things. So at this point, I would say I can't imagine a better scenario, but it's way easier to imagine a worse scenario. If you were to imagine if you just tried to wipe away all the detail and you were like, it turns out that to get intelligence out of computers, the thing you have to do is amass huge resources and just scale this like crazy process. What sort of people do you think will end up leading the organizations that do that? I would think you'd expect them to be a lot less thoughtful than they actually are. And I actually do think like the sort of, I've kind of a funny contrarian take on the Eliezer, Miri, rationality, EA, AI safety, whatever, that whole kind of nexus of people that have been concerned about this for a long time. My somewhat perhaps surprising take is that everybody, like many people, say they're wrong and stupid, but I think they're right. They've basically been right. And they've been ahead of the curve on the key issues. But then the other side is they feel like they're losing. And I actually feel like they've kind of won because the die is sort of cast at this point, and the leadership is pretty good. And like all of the major lab leaders have deeply engaged with the AI safety arguments. And that's probably the best you could really ever hope for. In a world, and because this is one of my other kind of fundamental parts of my worldview is data, it's data, compute, and algorithms, but data and compute matter most in the zoomed out macro historical sense. Algorithms matter a lot in terms of the exact character of the systems that we get. And I would bet that there are like algorithms that could prove to be disastrous and other algorithms that could prove to be great. But in terms of like whether or not AI is going to happen in some form, the data and compute kind of creates enough potential that somebody who's going to come along and find the architecture at some point. And indeed, like I think even, the transformer or whatever, it's kind of the one that has caught wind first and, driven a lot of the interest, but there are plenty of other alternatives that seem very viable. and we're starting to see like, oh, look at this, here's a, there was one that was a paper that was like ConvNet for the 2020s, a convolutional network for the 2020s, like literally just taking these old techniques and saying, what happens if we scale that up? Does that work similarly well? And, with nuance and maybe not quite or whatever, but like basically, yes, like a lot of these old techniques, if you scale them up massively, also start to work reasonably well. So I think like a lot of the ideas were actually had been hit on years ago. And what was really missing was the ability to do this scaling. And we needed the web, we needed all the data, we needed the cloud, we needed all the compute infrastructure. But now that that's there, I just think somebody was definitely going to come along and figure out an algorithm that could really work. And so when you look around the landscape and you're like, boy, every single one of these people has engaged in a really meaningful way with the concerns that the doomer set are really emphasizing. I think that's basically a win, and it's a counterfactual history in which they hadn't and couldn't be convinced to is like pretty easy to imagine for me. So, the first phase of the AI story, I think basically was sort of won by the safety crowd in as much as they got their ideas into the brains of the people that are going to be the key decision makers. And again, like I don't think you could hope for too much more than that, really.
Yeah, that is a good point as well. I don't spend much time thinking about how things could be worse, but now that I'm thinking about it, they definitely could be worse. And it's like kind of incredible that
worse.
Yeah, I mean, even like I don't know, like politicians, like it seems like Rishi Sunak was like personally convinced by like some of these like once esoteric X risk arguments, and like Ian Hogarth is like the chair of the UK AI Safety Institute, and he like wrote a piece in the Financial Times that was like, we need to slow down the race to godlike AI or whatever. So like, I mean, it's kind of amazing when you think about it. Like, this stuff has like gotten off, what was essentially just a bunch of forums and like blogs, like now just like being discussed in like major halls of power by like super important people. It is kind of incredible. It's definitely the opposite of that Tyler Cowen piece that came out the other day. It was like AI safety is dead or whatever, which is like kind of dumb. But
yeah, I'm a big fan of Tyler. I do not agree with that take.
Yeah, I didn't agree with that either. But yeah, that is a really good point.
And that's basically my next point. In terms of reasons to not be a hardcore doomer. You said it, society at large is not sleeping on this. And I would say the government's done better than I would have expected. We've had Time magazine covers, the Overton window is wide open. One thing I do think is dead is AI safety respectability politics. I've been around the scene long enough to remember when so much energy was put into, we got to not seem crazy. We like, this is really far out stuff. People are not going to be, inclined to listen to us. Anything we do that could make us seem crazy, is a fundamental loss of credibility. People put so much pressure on themselves. And that's honestly, I think that's like a pretty mature line of thinking for people that genuinely were bringing some weird ideas to the fore. And, and honestly, in many cases, we're kind of weird people. It's like, it takes weird people to think weird ideas. And so remarkable amount of self-awareness in the AI safety crowd historically, just to try to be so thoughtful about it. And I think it really speaks well to the intentions and the motivations of this group, that they were like willing to, be self-critical in such, kind of personal ways to try to figure out how can we be more effective communicators of what we think are really important ideas. We know we're a little bit weird reading to people, and we want to get that under control and be really careful and thoughtful about how we deliver our message. I think that is basically now over, though, because again, we've had, Eliezer in Time magazine calling for, willingness to use airstrikes in some scenario, and basically just everything is on the table, right? So that part of AI safety, I think the sort of, anxiety around, what if I say the wrong thing? Is it going to discredit the the field forever. Like, I think we can all leave that behind, which is good. And then the government has done really pretty well in terms of, I would say, just genuinely engaging with the subject matter. It's like the Biden executive order, I would say, is a pretty good thing. Policy is really hard, but to start with something that's like pretty light touch, that's not shutting down the practical utility, that has like a pretty reasonably chosen threshold that, contrary to what many people will claim, I think genuinely does only apply to a small number of very well-resourced companies, doing a 10 to the 26 flop model. Like, that's a pretty thoughtful, low impact, high leverage way to start to get a handle on the situation. And there's even the lesser known provision in that executive order around models trained on biological sequence data, which is that they have to be reported at 10 to the 23. And I think that's also really smart, because the AIs become superhuman in biological modalities way faster than they become superhuman at like language type tasks. Because we invented all the language tasks, we have experts in all of them. Nobody can like speak DNA in the way that models are likely to be speaking DNA over the next several years. So that's an area that, in my view, definitely demands extra attention. And they had that clause in there. It didn't get a lot of attention, but it is part of that order. So there's like clearly some very thoughtful people in government, and I'd say their approach has been like quite good. I'm broadly a very technology positive person, and kind of generally libertarian in my political outlook. I really don't like, I think it's sad that we don't have more nuclear energy, for example. And everybody in the AI space is like, we don't want to end up like nuclear energy, where like all the good stuff is somehow made illegal, and yet we still have all the like weapons. And I share that concern. I would hate to see us end up there. And we could, like that, as with all of these things, like it's not like the risk is taken off the table entirely, but it's a good start from the world's governments, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree. What are we on now? Was that six? I can't count.
Yeah, I combined society and government, so we've covered 6. Nice. So 7, I think probably covered enough, but basically, it seems to me like a sweet spot is possible to find and maybe hang out in for a while. And I think we've kind of just entered that sweet spot with GPT-4. The sweet spot being it's powerful enough to be really useful, but not so powerful that we have to worry about it getting out of control. This is a conclusion that I came to in my GPT-4 red teaming, where I spent 2 months in like basically total isolation, just testing it in every dimension that I could come up with. And I came back to OpenAI and said, I think this is safe to deploy, only because it's limited in power. You do not have it under control well enough that you could launch a much more powerful version. But this level of power, it's very useful to me, but I've like tried to see if it could show any signs of getting really out of control. And I cannot get it to be that powerful. So that's kind of the sweet spot. I think we've entered that range. And as we discussed earlier, I do think we probably have, one more turn of the scaling screw to go before, we'd have to worry about leaving that happy sweet spot range. At some point we do get out of it. I think I would be very surprised if we don't get out of that with, indefinite scaling. But that's kind of why I push this adoption acceleration and, hyperscaling pause agenda, because I think people broadly, like, even though a lot of people are using ChatGPT, I don't think the average person understands how much utility there already is. And if they did have a better understanding of just how capable the current systems are, I think they would also probably be a little bit more amenable to some sort of pause or slowdown, because they'd be like, geez, if it's already better than human doctors, can't we satisfy ourselves with that for a while before we have to go, 10x further on the inputs? And I'm not sure that everybody would be satisfied by that, but like the public, the sort of policymaker, it's you could imagine a scenario where these things are inseparable, right? That like the utility and the sort of potential for loss of control, just there's no like happy zone to be in. But it does seem to me that there is a happy zone to be in, and we've just entered it. And, hopefully we can kind of develop it before we race out the other side of it. But at least the fact that there seems to be that sweet spot in the first place is like something that, didn't necessarily have to be the case.
Yeah, true. I think people, or the general public, are already probably pretty into the idea of slowing down. I don't think you even have to convince them that they can like already get all of the utility out of current models. I know there's like some polling on this. I like don't know how much to read into it, but yeah, my perception is that people are not really into rushing to scale these models faster and faster. But yes, so reason 8.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so the last one on my list is China seems to be recognizing the threat in some important way. And I'm not by any means an expert on China, never been to China, can't read one Chinese character. So I'm like very modest in my assessment of, or my self-assessment of what I can realistically say about China. But I do hate the fact that it's often held up as the sort of, well, whatever, there may be risks, but, we just have to go because otherwise, China's going to do it. They're not going to stop, they'll never stop. Right. So we have to do it because we just have to beat China. I think that is like the worst mindset, maybe not the worst, but it's a bad mindset. And, certainly think we're in a much worse position if we end up in an AI arms race, US versus China, where it's like, the world depends on this. We did that once with the nuclear technology. We still got missiles all pointed at each other. And, I think we're like still in the era. I mean, it's like obvious that we're still in the era of nuclear threat, right? People have sort of gotten used to that background threat and like don't stress about it as much as they used to. And, maybe we're in a little bit of a less hair trigger situation than we were, in the 60s or whatever. But like, it's still really bad. There's still tons of missiles pointed at each other. And, the nuclear arms race is like not over really. So I would really hate to see us get into an AI arms race. And it is at least a positive, and this is probably the least positive point of all of these, because there is a lot of momentum for continued rivalry between the West and China, and whose system is going to prevail. And you hear there's like these echoes of the Cold War of where it's like our system versus their ideology, and so I don't mean to be like overly optimistic on this particular point, but at least it does seem that the Chinese government recognizes that this is potentially unwieldy technology, and they do seem to see it as a threat to their own government and like regime stability, if nothing else. I don't have a clear sense for whether Xi thinks that like we need to worry about AIs taking over the world, but I do think he's definitely worried about what it would do to social cohesion within China and like, the information landscape there. And so they are not like racing forward in a totally insane way, as far as I can tell. They are definitely doing stuff. They've got their own chat bots, plenty of researchers, definitely a huge contribution of overall research comes from Chinese researchers, whether they're in the United States or in China proper, but, or in the West or in China proper. But there at least seems to be like some sanity at the top. Not necessarily more sane than us, but like, I don't see them as being insane at this point. And that is better than the argument that I often hear that, well, we just have to keep going because China will never do anything but race ahead. I don't see that as being like a given. I do see that they have some appreciation for the unwieldiness of the technology and perceive it as like rightly, both dramatic upside potential, but also some what of a threat to their own power. And so I think seems like they're poised to like try to chart some sort of responsible course. And if we're both charting some sort of responsible course, then hopefully that can avoid, an all out arms race, where we throw other, reasons for caution aside because we have to beat them. Yeah. Of all of these, I do think that's the one that is most likely to fail. It's cross one off the list, that would be the first one to get crossed off.
We're still at 7 if we cross one off, so it's not that bad. But I think it's like the but China argument is like my least. Oh, it really, really annoys me because it's like true that it's clearly the case. They seem like they kind of have more motivation to regulate than like the US does, because presumably if you're like the CCP, you don't want super powerful chatbots just like spitting out whatever information. I mean, maybe their motivations are like bad, but like, they still have the motivation to maybe be more inclined to clamp down on this than the US or another Western country might be. So yes, I think it's silly. Also, like, it doesn't us like accelerating like help them accelerate, because then it's like they can just kind of copy stuff that we've done or whatever. I don't really know the details of that, but yeah, I just think that argument is kind of silly. Yeah, these are 8 good reasons. I feel slightly better now. I also think I should say that like I'm not like a hardcore doomer either. I think I share your radical uncertainty. I think mostly just because I'm like not a technical expert, so I think it like doesn't really make any sense for me to dismiss the optimists any more than it would make sense for me to dismiss the pessimists, if that makes sense. I kind of just have to be like, oh, I observed that all these people disagree. I guess I have no idea what's going to happen. So maybe I'm at 50% just because that's like a halfway point. But yeah, I think it's...
Well, I think you're in very good company there. The Anthropic post about their core views on AI safety is basically boils down to radical uncertainty. And there's, been pretty similar statements made from other leading lab leaders. So I honestly think that this is like maybe, like the bell curve meme, right? Where you've got the least capable analyst and the most capable analyst sharing the same idea. And then the one in the middle is the one that's the odd one out. I do think like the smartest, most plugged in, people with the most access to privileged information, they are also expressing pretty radical uncertainty. So I think that is like what the top of the field says, with a few exceptions. And then you've got a lot of people that are like way too in love with a particular argument, or, have sort of attach themselves to something, perceive this as being like a political issue already or something that may be somewhat knowledgeable, but this is it's a classic like Eliezer thing. Like when you're motivated to reach a certain conclusion, every logical trick that can in fact make you stupider. So mm-hmm. I think I'd say your position is like it's pretty savvy, really. I mean, the observed disagreement is high, but also the expressed radical uncertainty from many of the leading people is high. So between those two things, I think that's really the only sensible place for you to land. And I'm right there with you.
Yeah. Did you see, I think it's a Roman Yampolsky. It's a AI safety guy. He's like maybe the most pessimistic that exists. And he was like, my PGM is like 7 nines after the decimal place. And then Eliezer replied being like, that's a ludicrously high number. And obviously the implication is like, clearly there's only like 2 nines after the decimal place or whatever. And then there are all these people in his replies arguing about like how many decimal places it should be to. And I just thought that was like very, very funny. Like, I don't know, the person who's like, oh my God, it's ridiculous to say 99, like, but it's very reasonable to say 98. But yeah, I agree. I think anything over 90 is like clearly overconfident. Yes. Anyway.
There's a question of time scale too, I think is kind of, I haven't listened to his recent Lex Friedman interview yet, but one sleight of hand that people can sometimes pull on something like this is to just say like over the next, 10 million years or something. And then it's like, well, most species don't last millions of years. And we are definitely on course for radical change, I think, in any case. the question is like, can we get to some radically different future that, you know, we would feel like somewhat good about at least, and that the actual residents of, you know, find, you know, that it's good for them. And on that point, I'm like, you know, still like fairly radically uncertain, but definitely feel like there's no way to get to those like crazy nines. But if you were to ask a different question of like, does human existence in like roughly its current form go on for, you know, millions and millions of years, then I would also have to say, geez, that does seem quite unlikely. But that seems like just too, and I don't want to project this on them because I haven't even understood this person's take that much, but I do see that sleight of hand sometimes going on where it's like, define what is good to be like what is now too narrowly. And then, yeah, you're never going to be able to preserve that indefinitely. Yeah, but that's also like where we've come from, you know, is Robin Hanson, you know, is a great commentator on the point that we would, you know, freak out our own ancestors from not very many generations ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true.
And not in ways, and not necessarily in ways that they would approve of, but nevertheless in ways where we feel quite confident that like they're small-minded, you know, for their hypothetical rejection of our current lifestyle. So if we allow for something like that, then I think I don't see any way to get to like many nines of confidence.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think we should ban anyone giving a p-doom that is like to more than, I don't know, 2 decimal places or something. Just shouldn't be allowed. Maybe they should all be to like intervals of 5. I don't know. I'm just going to start legislating and everyone has to listen to me. Anyway, yeah, we should probably wrap up there, but this was really fun. Thank you for doing this. I imagine people already know where to find you, but on the off chance someone doesn't know where to find you, do you want to let people know, where they can follow your work?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you. It's been a great conversation. I've enjoyed it as well. And hopefully it's useful to, if not ease anxiety, at least give something, you know, tangible to build on and, you know, kind of, you know, believe that there's enough of a chance worth fighting for. My sense right now is that this is the most important issue of our time. I do think we're kind of walking a bit of a tightrope into the future. Everything is on the table, in my view, from, you know, radically utopian to radically dystopian or even extinction type outcomes. And, you know, it's going to be a societal kind of tug of war to try to figure out first, hopefully, like, what is actually going on? You know, can we make sense of all this stuff? And then secondarily, like, what should we do about it? But, you know, hopefully I've helped, you know, just at a minimum create the case that there's enough there that's worth fighting for. There's, you know, that this is not such a hopeless situation that the right thing to do is disengage. On the contrary, I think like there's definitely enough of a chance, you know, that if you're worried about this, like in my view, the right thing to do is be involved. There are a lot of different strategies that one can play, from chaining oneself to a fence to, you know, doing an analytical podcast about it. And I think people should play different strategies, right? Like the most brittle ecosystem is monoculture. And I think like the most brittle AI safety movement would be one where everybody does exactly the same thing. So I actually do think an ecology is kind of the right way to think about a movement. And, you know, without being like prescriptive on what strategy somebody should follow individually, I would definitely encourage anybody who has anxiety to like channel that into some sort of positive action, you know, that can play to their own strengths. Whether that's, again, chaining oneself to a fence or otherwise. So to find me online, I have the podcast. It's The Cognitive Revolution. It's at cognitiverevolution.ai. And other than that, I'm most active online on Twitter, where I am Labenz, my last name, Labenz.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again.
This has been a lot of fun. Thank you.